power to the people. Looking through my peephole, who's knocking at my door? Who is it? They say we ain't equals. One is for my
Hello,
people.
folks. Welcome to another week of New Sense Productions. This week, continuing with our topic of anti-oppression, of how to address oppression in the workplace,
Yes.
we're raising the question, what is the right way to deal with oppression in the workplace? We've seen examples of people policing Black bodies outside of work, and in the workplace, the response has been to fire these individuals. So does firing individuals that enact oppression on others, either through microaggression or through explicit racism, is firing them, does it actually solve the issue in our society?
That's a great question, Peyina.
Great question.
I'd actually like to think do you have anything right off the top? Sacha's coming to you.
I mean, I think off the top, I don't think that it solves the problem. Because that mindset, that individual can get a job somewhere else and still be set in their ways. So you're almost like spreading the cancer, spreading the disease of racism without having an actual fix or cure, or at least trying to solve any of the problems. So like my gut reaction is that, but I want to talk through that. I want us to kind of think through, because there may be some other options out there.
Yeah, I kind of come in different places on the continuum with it. I mean, just from a totally, I guess, personal place, like vulnerable place, I feel like I could have been that person at one point in time. The one, I mean, I definitely microaggress, I'm sure, on a daily basis. I'd like to think I've done work on myself now that allows it so that when people intervene on me or I intervene on myself, I recognize that. But I can think of earlier in my career, not so much around race, but more around gender and probably ways I could have done things better, not so much sexual assault, but just the way I handled probably as a team leader with men and women. And I could have seen myself actually having a gender bias back in the day in some ways. So I can, and I like to think the work I do now around diversity, equity, inclusion is really powerful for other white men and myself. And it's been a journey. So I have to take that into one stride. And to go along with what Sacha's saying, I do believe that if we're trying to systemically uproot oppression, in this case, we're talking about white supremacy or systemic racism, that the tendency, the cult of personality that allows us to make the one individual the pariah a lot of times and then divorce ourselves from any systemic connection to it. I'm not that white man. I'm not that man that rapes those women, so I don't have a gender issue. It allows so many of us with privilege, whether white or male or heterosexual or on down the insider category list, to not do the work on ourselves and to almost divorce ourselves from the issue. So I actually think that allows the oppression to perpetuate. On the flip side, being the father of a Black daughter now, and just being so much more aware of the everyday violence that people of color and others face, I also think there's a line you have to draw for safety and protection of people in the workplace. So I'm definitely interested in hearing some of your perspectives and stories as well.
Yeah, well, thank you both for sharing your initial perspective. And Noah, just reflecting on what you're saying, thank you also. It's so important that we, in this process, in our conversation that we're having, the three of us, also self-examine. And I appreciate that you did that first, to self-examine that you are a continuous work, that you acknowledge that you've come, that now you have more consciousness. And so similarly, if we make the parallel, what I'm hearing is these individuals, sure, they have offended others. They have committed oppression against others, but they deserve their journey too. And as part of society, like what is that role that society or the enterprise has in shaping individuals to society? I'm also hearing that if organizations firing them might be more of a kind of like a checkbox to kind of feel good about having done the work, right? And Sacha, I hear you saying that you see this in the workplace and you have stories to share. And so, and that you'd like to go deeper. So let's go there. What do you have to share that could help us unpack this question a bit more?
You know, I think, and Noah touched on it a little bit, is, you know, people see oppression as this big thing, right? It's very obvious. And they don't see the microaggressions. They don't see or understand how that plays into it. And, you know, I had a situation where at the time when it happened was when, right after the Starbucks incident took place. And so my situation took place, and I used Starbucks as an example. I was like, okay, so let's break this down into how this plays out in the workplace. So I'm doing my job, minding my business. You didn't feel as if that was the role that you wanted me to play. And so therefore, before saying anything to me, you went to the work police to have them to tell me to stop. Right? And so putting it in that context made this person realize, like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, I talk about Starbucks all the time, but I didn't see how I actually do this to someone. Right? And the same could be said with the Amy Cooper situation, where so many people have had their Amy Coopers, right? Where they've seen that play out in the workplace. But no one ever will claim, oh, I've been an Amy Cooper, right? Because they don't see themselves in that extreme. And so I think, you know, part of it is sharing these stories, talking about it, but doing so in a work environment where it's before you get to that punitive piece, right? Before, okay, we just need to fire you. Like, let's understand and unwrap what has happened, and the impact that they have, that has, right? We talk a lot about intent versus impact, right? The intentions were good, so they thought, right? But the impact is what causes damage. Right. And so those are the conversations that we're not having. We're starting to have now, because the country's on fire, right? But it shouldn't take that extreme in order for people to have that self-reflection that Noah just talked about.
Thank you. That's so important. The example that you shared, Sacha, and specifically about separating intention and impact, because I think part of the difficulty, and this leads to the conversation about the self-examination that Noah was talking about, because part of the difficulty I think we as individuals have in self-examining and acknowledging our own kind of acts of white supremacy and admitting that we might act as oppressors, and even I as an Asian woman, has to do with this association of intent to intent to the character of someone, as to whether they will actually enact acts of oppression. So in other words, they associate that rather than examine the overall impact of the behavior, and also the overall kind of norms and structures that have shaped how we behave, that are not necessarily associated with our intentions, right? So, yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And that also, yeah, go ahead, Noah. You were going to say something?
Finish your thought, then I'll jump in.
Oh, no, please go ahead. I think I'm just done. Yes.
I think too, I'm thinking about this, like even in regards of just how nuanced this can work. So as a DEI practitioner, that's a cisgendered, able-bodied, temporarily able-bodied white male that does anti-oppression work, and yet still has privileges and so many socially advantaged groups, if you will, white, male, so on. I find that the nuances at times of looking at myself and examining myself and if my behavior, even as I strive to talk about equity, if it's being inclusive or if it's shutting folks down. And it's a little bit of a different angle on this conversation, but it's the flip side of it. And it's like, how do I show up as a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner and advocate for folks that are maybe on the other side of that conversation or expressing ignorance from a place of seriously not knowing? And I've noticed my own emotional even as a white male, yes, but as someone who cares passionately about this, I've just noticed my emotional rawness has been really uptick lately, and I have been accused in a couple of situations of letting too much emotion out, and white people feeling like I might be pouncing on them. And then in one instance, really looking at my own actions too, and seeing like, wow, I went so fast into advocacy against oppression that I didn't totally seek to understand where the other person was coming from. And I really struggle with that piece of the work, because I find that if I go too far in observing where another insider is coming from, the impact to an outsider in that can often be looks like I'm colluding with them, that I'm like helping them normalize their feelings and mindset that could be oppressive. But if I don't do that, then particularly as a cisgendered man, to other women, and particularly as a white person to people of color, it's like I can also have that intensity that can be almost oppressive in its own way. So that's a spot I really struggle at as well in this work sometimes.
You know, as you say that, Noah, I think your perspective is important and needed right now in this space. And I say that because there are many practitioners that come into this from the angle of gender, right? Without any understanding of race, sexual orientation, anything. And so they have not even addressed their own biases in that space, yet are in positions of leadership as diversity experts. And that's a huge challenge. And because there is no connection, there is no self-reflection. And so for me, I tend to lean a lot on my white colleagues that don't call themselves allies, but have proven to be allies in this space, right? To step in and to help educate. Because we often say, you know, well, it's not the place of a marginalized individual to educate white people, right? Well, then who is? And so that's kind of where I think, particularly now, it's important to have the Noahs of the world around that get it, right? Because people are more, particularly white people, are more apt to let their guard down with you than if I was to say something, right? Like, because then all of a sudden, if I say something, I'm the angry Black woman. I'm not a DI practitioner. There, you know, it's only based off of my lived experience, not the 20 years that I've been actually studying this, right? So I think that it's a balance, but I appreciate the white practitioners in this space being able to step into that gap, because I think that's what's really needed right now.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Sacha. That's definitely, I would agree with you. And you both bring a very nuanced aspect to this work, which is that, you know, that balance, as you were saying, Sacha, between advocacy and meeting the other where they are. And when an organization, so going back to the topic, when an organization chooses to fire someone, maybe they think that's the right thing to do because they're thinking of advocacy, right? But then what is the larger social implication? And that requires what Noah is bringing, which is how to meet the other person where they are so that they can start taking the steps. I almost regret not having this quote with me, but it's a quote about, so like when you are in the coercive, the leading, the dominating position, no matter how eloquently you make your voice heard, no matter how eloquently it is said, it will still go unheard unless the other person is already walking towards you. And how do we get them to work towards us? Is to actually first listen to them so that they actually feel that they can lean towards you, right? So that brings in kind of, so we have at the macro level, that's at the individuals. And Sacha, you have brought up the example of co-workers or, you know, telling on some behavior to a supervisor before addressing it with you, right? And so in those situations, how do you address, or how did you address to balance this aspect of advocacy and leaning towards the person? Because we see a lot of those happening time and time again. My former experiences as well, where you know, nothing was said for a whole year or more, and then evaluation time comes and it's like, bang, despite all the good reviews here, I don't think you're fitting in, or whatever it is, right? So yeah, I would love to hear your perspective, Sacha. Or
You know,
Noah,
I'm
for
still
that matter.
trying to figure that out, right? Because what I have come to realize, and this is why I think the whole conversation around the Amy Coopers and as managers comes into play, because that mindset trickles down, right? And so in my situation, like, I realized the power of white women's tears, right? No, regardless of what I said and who I said it to, I didn't have that power.
What is that power for folks that might be watching right now? I just got
it's the power. It's the power that killed Emmett Till.
Damn.
Right. I mean, that's what it is.
Damn.
It's that power. It's the fragility. It's the protection of the sacred flower. That regardless of anything else, that's what's going to get protected. And I saw that
genocidal way.
Say it again.
In a patriarchal, white, racist way, genocidal way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it plays out, and not just in my situation, you know, it's like, I've seen that, and we've all seen it. It just plays out over and over and over again. And I think that was a big part of that Amy Cooper story, right? She knew that in changing her voice, the police would come and believe her. If we didn't see that recording, that could have happened in a very different way for Christian Cooper. Right?
It happens in school, when it happens when we report a Black student, it happens at work, like you said. And that's where I was going with my earlier story of making it personal. It's like, yeah, Amy Coopers aren't just, or Donalds, if you will, or Bobs, because we've seemed to genderize it against white women, which we, definitely should examine white women's racism, but white men obviously as well. Those folks are awesome. It's not just the internet is capturing these atrocious anti-Black behaviors in public, and those folks have always been in work. Like I shared with you at times in my journey, I've been parts of those folks, maybe not to that level, but in other ways in other people's journeys. So they've always been with us at work. And it's amazing to think that both of you as non-white people, in a sense, have actually had to deal with not getting fired by people in my group for maybe at times just showing up and being yourself and quote unquote advocating for yourself just to be in a healthy work environment. So that gives me
that brings up the topic of white solidarity, right? Like white solidarity. So in other words, it's like kind of defending the tears of the white woman, or defending the current ways of being as being the correct ways of being. And in part because if you think of it, I'm not trying to vilify anything, it's just, if you think of it, if this has been the way of being, and we think of ourselves as good people, because we like to think of ourselves as good people, then of course we're going to defend it, because it's a psychological need to feel that we're not erring all the time, or that we have been erring for all our lives, right? So it's just a psychological, natural tendency to do that, and so then so the question is then the social responsibility that the DEI practitioners have, that managers in positions have, for the individual well-beings of their employees, and then at a larger, more macro level that the organizations have for the communities outside of the organizations. Because as you mentioned, Sacha, earlier, the cancer will exist somewhere else, right? And so, what does that bring up for you guys in terms of the social responsibility aspect, if we were to bring this one layer of abstraction higher up?
Yeah. So two ends of it. I do want to underscore again, I do believe that the firing of overtly racist white people who erupt in the workplace or erupt in public in such a manner that it's also, it really does harm physically. And who's to define harm? I know that's where it's a sketchy line, but I do believe that there's a proper place for that, and that has probably been extremely underutilized in many companies for years. So I do want to be extremely clear about that. That said, everyday microaggressions, unconscious bias, and insiders, in this case, white people unaware of their white privilege and yet impacting the workplaces experiences of people of color because they are unaware of it. Yes, for me, what an inclusive, equitable company looks like is a company that invests in the well-being of its employees long-term by providing resources for an ongoing conversation and an ongoing way to reflect on that conversation and truly understand the business case for that. I believe that is a smart business practice, a 21st century best practice, and an inclusive way to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to add on to that. I think, what we often think through is like, how do we punish the perpetrator, right? Like that's kind of the go-to, let's fire this person, without thinking about like who has been harmed.
Bingo.
Right? And how do we take care of that individual?
Bingo.
Because what I see in these companies is like, okay, yep, let's get rid of that person. That's done. We don't have to deal with it.
Bingo.
What we're not addressing is the psychological harm that takes place.
Or the overall
trauma
culture that allowed it to take place that's still intact.
Exactly. And so it really is a systemic change that needs to happen. But, I think through the psychological support that is needed in that, because you're dealing with trauma. I mean, that's the piece that I don't think folks are quite ready to face, right? It's not just a one-time incident that took place. Right. For that person, that might have been the 10th thing at that company.
Right.
And so that builds upon each other. And so that's where I feel kind of companies need to go is, let's not just fire, but then let's also truly invest and protect our employees, and not see them as just cogs in a wheel, but humans, right?
Our
like they're
asset.
Yeah, our assets, right? Let's add humanity back into this.
That's an excellent point, Sacha. Sorry to interrupt you. We're gonna
no. That's all I was gonna say. Yeah, it's just like I think that's a missing element.
Yeah. What would be a concrete example of addressing the psychological damage of the person that was the receiver of the aggression?
I think number one, starting with that person and asking that person, probably in a variety of ways, including with people that they feel comfortable with, and taking the time to slow down and maybe even be in an uncomfortable position for a little bit of time while you strive to figure out how to first have that person be listened to in a way that feels respectful and restorative to them. But for me, I've gone wrong when I haven't done that, and when I've set to rectify a situation based off my feelings of guilt and feeling like knowing that I have behaved in a way that's less of myself than I'm capable of.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a fundamental reprogramming of human resources. Mm-hmm. And anyone that knows me was, I always say HR's job is to protect the company and mitigate risk. If we put the human back into human resources, then if a complaint comes forward, it's not as if they're just, okay, what policies have been broken? Like they're not just going through their checklist, but they are circling back to that employee. How can we help you? Right? What resources can we provide other than, EAP? Right? Understanding the psychological aspects behind this and supporting that. I think that's a big piece of this. And in all honesty, I don't think that a lot of HR professionals are even trained in DEI to understand microaggressions, to understand bias, to understand how this plays out in the workplace so that they can even respond appropriately. Right. So I think it's a fundamental shift in how some of these systems are already in place.
Yeah, and I would add to that, examining current standards, quote unquote, standards of practice. Yeah. Because a lot of those standards are based on a male, white culture, even like the concept of executive leadership, right? That in itself is a very kind of white culture oriented type of thing. So examining those standards and acknowledging that when we're saying team player and fit, if the
Cultural fit,
majority
yes.
of the yes, if the majority of the organization is white, then I'm sorry, but assessing someone based on their fit and on their what is it, level of team player is in itself a form of racism, because then you're already ignoring the difference that this person has from the rest of, from the 99% of the rest of the organization, right?
That's the equity lens that needs to be flipped. The assessment is
Exactly.
the perpetrator somebody that needs to be removed from the organization for their own health and the health of other employees, or is this someone who is actually in a place where restorative justice and education and awareness could actually lead them to being a better leader and probably a happier person for themselves? I mean, a company can't decide that second piece, but certainly a better leader and a more inclusive leader. So I agree that that equation needs to be flipped on in its side equity.
Yeah.
So thanks for segueing us to restorative justice, right? As a company cannot decide that, but this is a societal problem. So if you will, like, what if we talked a little bit about what restorative justice might look like between intercompany type of thing, like the fabric of our community? What might that look like, restorative justice?
You know, I'm not a I'm not trained or certified in it, but I know we have listeners that are, so let me go ahead and claim that. But I take that on a higher level to the act of equity, meaning that one who microaggresses or is part of a macroaggression culture takes steps to rectify it by doing their own work, understanding their levels of power and privilege first. Secondly, making that authentic to them, meaning going on a journey with that. And third, are able to show that they understand it in their words and actions by changing their mindset and behavior moving forward.
Let's take that a step further, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And I say that because, and we talked about this a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
You know, it's the work that's being done in corporations. They're doing unconscious bias training. They're doing all of these things.
Right.
5 o'clock comes, okay, that was work. I go home and I still act biased. I still live in a very
all
segregated,
my world, or all whatever
right,
world all of a sudden.
segregated community.
Yep.
And so it's like, that's the piece that I think people need to start. Like, what are you learning? Yep. And how do you start to unlearn those things so that it manifests themselves in your personal life?
And comes back with you.
And it comes back. You know, we always talk about, you know, oh, bring your authentic self to work.
Right.
And I always joke and say, they don't want me to bring my authentic self to work. Like, they won't be able to handle it. But the flip side of that is, you know, if you are moved by something at work, how does that then move you at home? How do you change the conversation with your spouse or your children or at church or whatever it is? Like, how do you truly transform as an individual? Because I think that's where the change happens. And I think that's the power of corporations, right? They can invest that money into you at work. And so, but how it's up to you, as Noah was saying, is that individual piece of how do I then take this learning and have this show up in other aspects of my life?
So that conversation is definitely going in the direction of the importance and value of investing in elevating each one's level of consciousness and awareness on the issue, because companies can invest, but how they invest, so transforming the training from a top down, this is what you need to know, these are the facts, the skills you need to know, to a more evoking awareness, enabling learning type of approach, so that then the initiative comes from the individuals, because it's when individuals can start self-examining and becoming more self-conscious and willing to acknowledge, much like Noah was acknowledging earlier, all the journey that he's gone through. That's more laudable and acceptable for change than if someone were continuously saying that they're the do-gooder, the you know, doing good without being able to self-examine, right?
Yes. Well, and tying it back to your original question though, with restorative justice and underscoring a point I was saying earlier, and in order for that to be equality and about justice, the person who has been harmed or microaggressed against, or the groups that have been ostracized or marginalized, need to have their voices centered in the conversation, which is why in this moment, when we know racism impacts all people of color, we know we're beginning to understand how it also expressly impacts those with the darkest skin. And so you apply that lens to equity back in the organization, you take the voice and the microphone to those impacted most and understand what from them first, also what do they need for themselves to be restored, remunerated, or rejuvenated. And then the other piece to it is, and what can the perpetrator or the culture that has been perpetrating oppression do to increase its awareness and to change its behavior and mindset. And they might need space from each other to do it, and they might not. So there's different nuanced pieces to it.
Yeah, and I'm also not an expert in restorative justice at all, but I know that in the previous day conversations we've talked about the investment that organizations can have with community organizations that do restorative justice or that are investing in kind of building the fabric of anti-oppression, and see what is it that they can do in collaboration so that outside the walls of the organization is taking a step into social responsibility. So now you're not firing the Amy Cooper, and I'm sorry to use that female name because as Noah had mentioned, it's kind of like we're shaming the woman when the culture is out of a patriarchy, like white supremacy. But anyway, so not firing.
And white women have traditionally had their racism gone undetected. So I'm not, again, just highlighting the systemic need for the conversation and recognizing how privilege still intervenes itself even in social justice discussions. Yeah.
Right. Yes, and going back to what I was saying, it's like enabling the social responsibility of organizations to bleed outside of the organizational walls into social responsibility.
Yeah, tie it back to the business goals, right? Mm-hmm. That's where it really,
if it's business, hell yeah.
If it's business, right? And so that way, how does restorative justice look for a shoe company or, for a nonprofit? Do the work and really try to tie those things together so that it's not a checkbox or a nice to have or charity, right? But it's really a part of the business imperative of that company.
Right. And that's so important that it's not part of a checkbox, because when it is, there's a lot of performative behavior happening where it's like, I must do this. And then we had this conversation about front stage, backstage, where then I'm doing it in order to look good and to have that checkbox and to be evaluated positively there. And then when I retrieve, I have this other aspects of myself, or it might backfire more because I've had to put up a face, a completely different face that's not authentic. And so we go back to the authentic examination again.
And it goes back to people getting fired. And in my experience too, again, some people should, but oftentimes the people getting fired are the people actually talking about racism and race. And so it's not that they were perpetuating, it's that they were bringing it up. And so so therefore that's the trouble. So, again, that firing thing without the systemic piece, there's a piece to it, but it can really swing in many ways. We could go on with this, Peyina.
I know. I'm looking at time. I know. So we've covered so much, talking about, just like whether it's firing the Amy Cooper organization, addressing the solution. I'm hearing that it is necessary to take actions to say this is not okay, while at the same time it is important to address the psychological needs of the employees that have been oppressed, as well as ensure that the organization has ways to address social responsibility beyond the organizational walls, and as well as practices that are not a top-down training, but an evoking awareness, self-examination, and a complete kind of more balanced approach. Any final thoughts before we close?
Noah? I'm still putting my thoughts together.
I'm always ready to jump in. I'll be trying to step back. My final thought, I saw this great post last night. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically it was saying something along the lines of, if your social media feed is beginning to return back to quote unquote normal and you find yourself relieved, that's the problem. And I think right now, again, my theme is we need deep structural solutions. We've had the gift, as weird as it seems, of this COVID interruption to actually feel the impact of centuries of racial injustice. And that's just in our country. I know this is reverberating around the world. And we have got, if we as human beings, and human beings in this case with white skin, understand that on some level of our heart, we have got to slow down and hold this space more. And I see a really big awareness starting to happen, and it makes me excited. But we can't rush, just like we can't rush to a one point finger solution. We can't rush to solving this for our own feelings of unease. So again, let's hold space for this and let's continue to just disrupt and look at our own mindsets.
Yeah, my thoughts are similar in this time of COVID. You know, we're always talking about this new normal. And with COVID, we saw the disparities in healthcare. We saw the disparities in education around race. And, you know, I've often had the conversation of how do you build equity into this new normal? And so now with all of this racial unrest, it's still this, how do we build equity into this, but how do we also build anti-racism into this? How do we break systems that have been holding people back or uplifting only a certain few? And so this is a very unique time in order to really build a new normal and really level the playing ground. And, you know, kind of to Noah's point, if we don't do it now and we're like, okay, this is just going to pass and we'll get back to normal, then we would have wasted this time in history.
Amen. What about
Amen.
you? What are your last thoughts, words?
Yeah, well, hard to build on that. That beautifully said, Sacha. But what comes to mind is that it's really an important time to really question standards that have been put in place. All these standards are based on white male culture. Despite all the reforms that have happened since the 60s and 70s, the norms continue in our daily behavior, right? And so just examining all these standards of practice, standards of what team play looks like, standards of what executive leadership looks like, and at the same time, also, it's important to give grace, kind of also perfectionism, because along with it, it's like it's okay to err. Erring and the discomfort of it is what enables us to accept change.
Yeah, come on. Power to the people, looking through my peephole, who's knocking at my door.
Hey, listeners out there, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We see you starting to sign up. Join that movement. Your voices are literally informing the content and character of this show. And we look forward to bringing new voices into upcoming segments.
Yes, thank you.
Peace.
Bye.
Fresh J's across my flow, and we running.